A crowded airplane, a tense atmosphere, and an innocent 7-year-old black boy sitting quietly in his seat. Suddenly, a furious flight attendant leans over him, her face twisted with anger. Without warning, bam! She punches him, shocking everyone around. Gasps fill the cabin, but she has no idea. She just made the worst mistake of her life. Because this boy, his father owns the entire airline. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with me till the end, because this story is about to take a shocking turn. Discrimination and abuse of power are still very real issues, even in places where we least expect them. Imagine boarding a flight, excited for your journey, only to be met with cruelty from someone who is supposed to ensure your safety. That's exactly what happened to a young black boy on this flight. A flight attendant, blinded by her arrogance and prejudice, did something so outrageous that it sent shockwaves through the entire airline industry. But what she didn't know was that she had just messed with the wrong child, because his father wasn't just any passenger. He owned the airline. What happened next turned the entire situation upside down. Stay with me, because this story is one you won't believe. This isn't just a story about a rude flight attendant. It's about justice, power, and karma hitting back harder than anyone expected. What started as an act of arrogance quickly turned into a nightmare for the airline staff. Passengers were left stunned. The flight crew panicked, and the airline itself faced consequences they never saw coming. How did the boy's father react? What happened to the flight attendant? And how did this one shocking moment change everything? Keep watching, because this story will leave you speechless. It all started on a routine flight from New York to Los Angeles. Among the passengers was a well-dressed young black boy, just 7 years old, quietly sitting in his seat. He had been taught to mind his manners, so he stayed calm, his small hands folded in his lap. But for some reason, the flight attendant assigned to his section seemed to have a problem with him. At first, it was subtle. She walked past him without acknowledging his polite hello. When he asked for a cup of water, she rolled her eyes and sighed before handing it to him with an annoyed expression. Passengers nearby noticed the tension, but no one said anything, yet. Then things escalated. The boy had been given a first-class seat, something the flight attendant clearly didn't agree with. She questioned him harshly. "Where are your parents?" she demanded. The boy, a little confused but still polite, responded, "My dad will be waiting for me when I land." That wasn't enough for her. She sneered, looking him up and down. First class is for paying customers, not for little kids playing pretend. A few passengers started to glance over, sensing something was off. But before anyone could intervene, the situation took a shocking turn. The flight attendant, perhaps thinking no one would care, suddenly leaned in closer and punched the boy on his shoulder. A gasp spread through the cabin. The boy's face froze in shock, pain flashing across his eyes. He wasn't crying. He was too stunned to react. The passengers around him immediately erupted in disbelief. "Did she just hit him?" one woman said aloud. But the flight attendant still had no idea. No idea who this boy really was. And in just a few moments, she would regret ever laying a hand on him. It all started on a routine flight from New York to Los Angeles. Among the passengers was a young black boy, just 7 years old, sitting quietly in his seat. He was dressed sharply in a suit and tie, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. Unlike other children his age who might be excitedly chatting or fidgeting, he remained calm, well-mannered, and composed. But for some reason, the flight attendant assigned to his section seemed to have a problem with him. At first, it was subtle. She walked past him without acknowledging his polite hello. When he asked for a cup of water, she rolled her eyes and sighed, handing it to him without a word. It was the kind of rudeness that most people would brush off, but something about her demeanor suggested it wasn't just impatience. It was something deeper. Then things escalated. When the meal service started, the flight attendant purposefully skipped over him. Confused, the boy politely raised his hand and said, "Excuse me, miss, I didn't get my meal." The flight attendant barely looked at him and responded coldly, "That's not my problem. Meals are for paying customers." A few passengers nearby turned their heads, frowning. They had clearly seen her serve meals to everyone else, and there was no reason to assume the boy wasn't a paying customer. A woman seated across the aisle spoke up. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think you skipped him. He's a child. He needs to eat." The flight attendant shot the woman a sharp look, her patience clearly wearing thin. "I don't need you telling me how to do my job," she snapped. The boy, still trying to be respectful, simply nodded and said, "It's okay," though his eyes showed a hint of sadness. But then came the moment that changed everything. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned, this time with an even worse attitude. She crossed her arms and stared at the boy. "Who are you traveling with?" she asked. The boy looked up at her, a little confused. "I'm traveling alone. My dad will meet me when I land." The flight attendant's lips curled into a sneer. "And you're in first class? Who bought your ticket?" The boy blinked, not understanding why she was questioning him like this. "My dad did," he answered honestly. The flight attendant let out a short, mocking laugh. "Oh, really? And what does your dad do?" At this point, several passengers were starting to pay closer attention. The boy hesitated for a moment before answering. "He owns this airline." The flight attendant's smirk deepened, clearly not believing a word. "Right. And I'm the Queen of England," she said sarcastically. "Look, kid, I don't know how you got this seat, but first class isn't for kids playing make-believe. Maybe next time, your dad can buy you a ticket in economy where you belong." The boy's eyes darkened slightly, but he remained silent. He wasn't the type to argue or fight back. He had been raised better than that. But what happened next shocked everyone. The flight attendant suddenly leaned in closer, lowering her voice but making sure everyone around could still hear. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her tone full of venom. Then, without warning, she raised her hand and punched the boy on his shoulder. Gasps filled the cabin. The passengers who had been watching were now in complete shock. A woman in the row behind them let out an audible, "Oh my God!" The boy's small frame jerked slightly from the impact, but he didn't cry out. His eyes widened in shock, his breathing quickened, but he stayed silent. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing him react. The entire section of the plane fell into a stunned silence. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. The passengers exchanged horrified glances, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. A man seated a few rows ahead turned around and said loudly, "Did she just hit him?" The flight attendant, realizing that people were now fully aware of what she had done, straightened up and cleared her throat, trying to act as if nothing had happened. "He was being disrespectful," she muttered, as if that excused her actions. But she had no idea what she had just done, no idea who this boy really was. And in just a few moments, she would regret ever laying a hand on him. The entire cabin was now filled with tension. The passengers were stunned, whispering among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, recording what had just happened, while others sat frozen in disbelief. The little boy, still in shock, slowly looked up at the flight attendant. But instead of breaking down or crying, he did something no one expected. He calmly reached into his pocket, pulled out a small business card, and handed it to the passenger sitting next to him. The man took it, his eyes scanning over the name printed in bold letters. Then his face turned pale. The card read, "CEO and founder, Legacy Airlines." The man's head snapped up as he looked at the boy, his mouth slightly open in shock. He glanced around at the other passengers and then back at the flight attendant, who was still standing there, looking irritated. You don't know who he is, do you?" The man finally spoke, his voice laced with disbelief. The flight attendant scoffed. "Who cares? He's just some kid who doesn't belong in first class." The man shook his head. "You just assaulted the son of the owner of this airline." Silence. A pin could have dropped, and it would have been the loudest sound in the cabin. The flight attendant blinked, her face momentarily frozen before she let out a nervous laugh. "Yeah, right. You think I'm going to believe that?" The boy finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Call the pilot. He knows who I am." A few passengers immediately chimed in. "Yeah, call the pilot. Let's see if she's still laughing then. This is unacceptable. She hit a child." Now, the flight attendant wasn't looking so confident anymore. The weight of the moment was finally sinking in. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the front of the plane. But it was too late. A flight supervisor, who had been alerted by the commotion, was already walking down the aisle toward them. "What's going on here?" the supervisor asked, his voice stern. The passengers wasted no time. "She hit this boy," one woman exclaimed. "She refused to serve him, and then she assaulted him," another added. "She was rude the entire time," a man chimed in. The supervisor's eyes widened as he turned to the boy. "Is this true?" The boy simply nodded and handed the business card to the supervisor. The moment the man read the name, his face drained of color. He turned sharply to the flight attendant, his tone now ice-cold. "Come with me. Now." The flight attendant opened her mouth to argue, but the supervisor cut her off. "Not another word. You are in serious trouble." The passengers watched as she was escorted away, her face pale, her arrogance completely shattered. Some people even clapped as she disappeared down the aisle. But this wasn't over yet, because at 35,000 feet in the air, a message had already been sent directly to the CEO himself, the father of the boy she had just assaulted. And when they landed, she was about to face consequences she never could have imagined. As the plane continued soaring through the sky, word spread fast. Passengers whispered among themselves, some still in shock, others furious. The flight attendant who had once held so much arrogance was now nowhere to be seen. Removed from her duties and ordered to sit in the back of the plane under strict supervision. But the real storm was only just beginning. Because down on the ground, inside the headquarters of Legacy Airlines, the CEO had just received the message. The private notification came directly from the airline's security team. At first, he thought it had to be some kind of mistake. His son, assaulted? By one of his own employees? It seemed almost unbelievable. But then, his phone buzzed again. This time with video evidence. Passengers had recorded everything. The dismissive attitude, the cold remarks, and the moment the flight attendant struck his child. As he watched the footage, the CEO's jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists. The entire boardroom fell silent as they observed their usually composed leader transform before their eyes. Without wasting a second, he picked up his phone and made a call to the airline's head of operations. "Pull her employee file. I want everything on my desk before that plane lands," he ordered, his voice dangerously calm. "And tell the flight captain to escort my son directly to me the moment they touch the ground. Oh, and one more thing." His eyes darkened as he replayed the footage in his mind. "I want her out. Immediately." Back on the plane, tension was thick in the air. The passengers knew something big was coming, and the flight crew, especially those who had been close with the now disgraced flight attendant, were starting to look nervous. They had witnessed her behavior but had done nothing to stop it. And now, it was too late to change sides. Sitting quietly in his seat, the young boy remained calm. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply waited. Because he knew justice was coming. As the flight began its descent, the entire crew could feel the weight of what was about to happen. The air was thick with tension, and passengers were still buzzing with shock over what they had witnessed. Some whispered about the fate of the flight attendant, while others kept their eyes on the boy, now sitting quietly with an unreadable expression. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain received a direct order from headquarters. Upon landing, the boy was to be escorted immediately to a private lounge where his father was waiting. No exceptions, no delays. The disgraced flight attendant, now trembling with fear, sat in the back of the plane, staring blankly ahead. Reality was finally sinking in. She had thought she was in control, that she could treat a young passenger however she pleased without consequence. But now, the weight of her actions was crashing down on her. As the wheels touched the ground and the plane taxied toward the gate, security teams were already positioned at the terminal. The flight crew exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that something massive was about to unfold. The moment the doors opened, a team of security personnel stepped inside. The passengers gasped, watching as they moved straight toward the back of the plane. The flight attendant's face drained of all color. She barely had time to process what was happening before she was escorted off the aircraft under the eyes of everyone who had witnessed her downfall. The boy, however, was met with a completely different reception. As he stepped off the plane, a group of well-dressed executives and high-ranking airline officials were waiting for him. At the center of them all stood his father, the powerful CEO of Legacy Airlines, a man known for his calm demeanor and sharp decision-making. But at this moment, his face was unreadable. The second his son reached him, He bent down, placed a hand on his shoulder, and asked, "Are you okay?" The boy nodded. He didn't need to say much. His father already knew everything. The CEO stood up straight, his eyes now locked on the airline's security team. "Where is she?" One of the officers responded, "She's in custody, sir." Without another word, the CEO turned and walked toward the private security office, where the flight attendant was being held. She was seated at a table, her once confident posture now completely gone. She had been stripped of her uniform badge, and her employee ID lay on the table in front of her. When she saw the CEO enter, her breath hitched. She knew who he was, and she knew that whatever happened next would define the rest of her life. The CEO slowly took a seat across from her. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He simply stared at her, his silence more terrifying than any words could have been. Then, finally, he spoke. "You had the privilege of working for my airline. You were given a position of trust, one where people depend on you for safety and respect. And this is how you treat a child." The flight attendant swallowed hard. "Sir, But he raised a hand, cutting her off. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to justify what you did. The footage speaks for itself." Tears welled in her eyes as she realized there was no way out. "You are fired, effective immediately," the CEO said coldly. "Your employment record will reflect what you did here today. And trust me, you will never work in this industry again." The flight attendant gasped, panic setting in. "Please, He stood up, ignoring her plea. "Escort her out." The security team stepped forward, taking her by the arms. As she was led away, she turned back one last time, eyes filled with regret. But it was too late. The damage was done. Meanwhile, the boy and his father walked out of the terminal together. The CEO placed a protective arm around his son's shoulder, knowing that justice had been served. The passengers who had witnessed everything took to social media, spreading the story far and wide. Within hours, it went viral, sending shockwaves through the airline industry. Because this wasn't just about one incident. This was about power, accountability, and the reminder that no one is above consequences. The world quickly took notice. Social media exploded with outrage, and news outlets picked up the shocking story. People demanded answers, questioning how someone like that flight attendant had ever been allowed to work in such a position of responsibility. Legacy Airlines swiftly released an official statement, assuring the public that justice had been served and that new policies would be implemented to prevent such incidents in the future. As for the boy, he never once bragged about who his father was. He didn't seek revenge or demand special treatment. He simply knew that the truth would speak for itself. And in the end, it did. The former flight attendant, now unemployed and disgraced, learned a lesson she would never forget. Because sometimes, the people you underestimate the most are the ones who hold the most power.